January 17, 1944. The waters off the Marshall Islands. The horizon trembled with heat. Beneath a sky the color of bleached bone, the Pacific Ocean stretched endless and indifferent, its surface reflecting the cruel brilliance of the tropical sun. In the operations room of the Imperial Japanese Navy's coastal observation post on Roy Namur, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto pressed binoculars against his face, his hands slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. Through the salt-stained lenses he watched something that shouldn't exist. A ship so vast it seemed to occupy not just space but possibility itself. Its flight deck longer than 3 city blocks, its silhouette reshaping the very meaning of naval warfare. He had read the intelligence reports. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of USS Enterprise steaming into battle position, her aircraft already beginning their deadly dance into the sky. In that moment, watching the gray Leviathan maneuver with impossible grace for something so massive, Yamamoto understood with perfect clarity that Japan had not merely engaged a powerful enemy. They had awakened something that would devour the ocean itself. The story of the most dangerous American warship of World War II is not simply the biography of a vessel. It is the chronicle of industrial might transformed into strategic revolution, of a nation's engineering genius converted into the instrument that would break an empire's back across 10,000 miles of contested sea. The Essex-class carriers would eventually dominate the Pacific theater, and the Iowa-class battleships would become floating fortresses of destruction. But one ship, commissioned before Pearl Harbor thrust America into global war, would earn a reputation so fearsome that enemy forces gave her a name whispered with something approaching religious dread. The Gray Ghost. USS Enterprise, designated CV-6, would become the most decorated ship in United States naval history, and the most lethal single instrument of naval warfare the Pacific War would ever witness. To understand why Enterprise became the scourge of the Imperial Japanese Navy, one must first comprehend the revolution she represented. The aircraft carrier as a concept had existed since the First World War, but the interwar years had seen it evolve from experimental platform to potential game-changer. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had inadvertently accelerated this evolution by limiting battleship construction while leaving carrier development relatively unrestricted. American naval architects, freed from the straitjacket of traditional naval thinking, had begun designing vessels that would project power not through the range of their guns, but through the reach of their aircraft. Enterprise, laid down in July 1934 and commissioned in May 1938, represented the culmination of this revolutionary thinking, a Yorktown-class carrier displacing 9,800 tons, capable of carrying up to 90 aircraft, and built not for the naval warfare of the past, but for the three-dimensional chess game that future combat would demand. The ship measured 809 feet in length, her flight deck a vast wooden plane that seemed to defy physics in its size and simplicity. Her propulsion system could drive her at 32 knots faster than most battleships, giving her the speed to close with enemies or withdraw from danger as strategy demanded. But her true weapon was not her hull or her engines. It was her air group, the squadrons of Grumman F-4F Wildcats, Douglas TBD Devastators, and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers that could strike targets 200 miles distant, far beyond the range of even the largest naval rifles. In the doctrine of the United States Navy entering 1941, carriers were still viewed as support vessels for the battle line of dreadnoughts. Enterprise and her sisters would prove that thinking was fatally obsolete within the first 6 months of war. December 7, 1941. Should have been the end of the Enterprise story before it truly began. Admiral Husband Kimmel had dispatched her from Pearl Harbor on November 28th, carrying Marine Corps fighters to reinforce Wake Island. The mission had been routine, the kind of ferry operation carriers performed regularly in peacetime. But weather delayed her return, and on that Sunday morning when Japanese carrier aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves, Enterprise was still 200 miles west of Oahu, her crew unaware that the world had changed. The attack that crippled the Pacific Fleet's battle line, sinking or damaging 8 battleships, missed the Enterprise by the narrowest of margins. Had she been in port, trapped in the shallow waters of the harbor, American naval aviation would have lost 1/3 of its carrier strength before firing a shot in anger. Instead, fate and weather had preserved her for the storm to come. The Japanese pilots returning to their carriers that morning believed they had achieved a decisive victory. They had indeed inflicted catastrophic damage, but they had missed the oil storage tanks that fueled the Pacific Fleet, failed to destroy the repair facilities that would resurrect damaged ships with startling speed, and most critically had not caught a single American aircraft carrier in port. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the strike force, had debated launching a third wave to destroy these vital installations, but had withdrawn instead. Concerned about American carrier locations and the vulnerability of his own ships, that decision, born of caution, would prove one of the war's pivotal moments. The battleships could be raised and repaired. The infrastructure could be protected. But the carriers, untouched and now carrying the full weight of American naval power in the Pacific, would become the instrument of Japan's destruction. For the men serving aboard Enterprise in those first chaotic months of 1942, the war was not an abstraction or a grand strategic vision. It was exhaustion that seeped into bones, the constant vibration of the ship at high speed, the chemical stink of aviation fuel and the copper taste of fear during air raids. Machinist's mate Second Class Robert Watkins, in a letter to his wife that would survive the war, described the transformation of the crew from peacetime sailors into warriors. "We don't talk much about what we're doing, maybe because if we said it out loud, we'd understand how scared we really are. But when the Japs come, when the general quarters alarm splits the air and you run to your station, the fear doesn't matter anymore. There's just the job: load the guns, arm the planes, keep the ship alive. And when our boys come back with empty racks and shot-up wings, when they tell us they hit a carrier or sent a cruiser to the bottom, you feel something you didn't know you could feel, like maybe we're going to win this thing after all." The Japanese High Command had expected a short war. Their strategic planning anticipated 6 months of victories while America reeled, followed by a negotiated peace that would recognize Japan's greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The racial theories popular in Japanese military circles reinforced this assumption. Western powers, soft from decades of comfort and democracy, would lack the will to sustain a long Pacific war against a racially pure, spiritually superior enemy. American industrial capacity was acknowledged but dismissed as irrelevant in the decisive battles that would determine the war's outcome. What the Japanese strategists failed to comprehend was that American naval doctrine, particularly in the hands of aggressive commanders like William Halsey and Raymond Spruance, would not allow them the breathing space their strategy required. Enterprise and her sisters would contest every mile of ocean, turn every Japanese advance into a struggle, and gradually transform the war from the quick campaign Tokyo expected into a grinding attritional nightmare that played directly to American industrial strengths. February 1, 1942, the Marshall and Gilbert Islands lay under Japanese occupation. Forward bases in the Empire's defensive perimeter, Enterprise, paired with Yorktown and protected by cruisers and destroyers, launched the war's first American carrier offensive against these positions. The raids were tactically modest, destroying facilities, sinking small vessels, forcing the Japanese to disperse defensive resources. But strategically, they announced that the United States Navy had not been cowed by Pearl Harbor, that the Pacific Fleet retained offensive capability, and that Japanese-held territory was not immune to American power. For the crew of Enterprise, these raids provided the first intoxicating taste of striking back, of making the enemy pay. Aviation Ordnanceman First Class James Sullivan recalled the atmosphere on the hangar deck as planes were armed for the raids. There was this focus, this intensity. Every bomb we hung on those Dauntlesses, every belt we loaded into those Wildcats, it felt personal. Like we were answering for Pearl. The Japs had sucker-punched us, but now we were standing up, fists ready, showing them they'd picked a fight with the wrong country. April 18, 1942. Brought Enterprise into one of the war's most audacious operations, the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. While the B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet, Enterprise provided combat air patrol, protecting the task force as it penetrated to within 650 miles of Japan's home islands. The raid itself inflicted minimal physical damage, but its psychological impact on both sides was profound. For Americans still reeling from months of defeats across the Pacific, it demonstrated that Japan itself was vulnerable, that American bombers could reach the sacred homeland. For the Japanese military, particularly the Imperial Navy, it was a humiliation that demanded response. The plan Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto developed to prevent future raids, a decisive battle that would destroy America's carrier force and potentially force a negotiated peace, would lead directly to Midway, the battle that would break the back of Japanese naval aviation and establish Enterprise as the most dangerous ship in the Pacific. June 4, 1942. The IDS waters northwest of Midway Atoll, the battle that unfolded across that vast expanse of ocean would be decided not by battleship guns but by dive bombers dropping from the sun, by torpedoes running straight and true, by the courage of pilots who pressed attacks against overwhelming odds. Enterprise launched her first strike at dawn, her dauntless dive bombers and devastator torpedo planes forming up in the pre-dawn darkness before setting course for the Japanese carrier force. The morning's first attacks went poorly. The torpedo squadrons were slaughtered by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, achieving no hits while losing 41 of the 41 torpedo planes from all three American carriers. But those doomed torpedo attacks had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the upper air undefended. When Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's dive bombers running low on fuel, having missed the Japanese force initially, and found them only by following the wake of a straggling destroyer down onto the unprotected Japanese carriers, the Pacific War's balance shifted in 5 minutes. The Dauntlesses from Enterprise and Yorktown fell on the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with devastating precision. Bombs penetrated flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, igniting infernos that consumed the ships from within. Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, was transformed into a blazing wreck. Kaga and Soryu suffered similar fates. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that would cripple Yorktown. But Enterprise's scouts found her that afternoon, and Enterprise's dive bombers sent her to the bottom, completing the destruction of Nagumo's strike force. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and the cream of her naval aviation, the irreplaceable pilots and aircrew who had trained for years, who had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific. The United States lost 1 carrier and paid dearly in aircrews, but had halted Japanese expansion and seized strategic initiative that would never be relinquished. For the crew of Enterprise, Midway was validation that the ship, her aircraft, and her men could stand against the best the Imperial Navy could offer and emerge victorious. But it was also a harbinger of the grinding campaign that would follow. Lieutenant Richard Best, who had led the dive bomber attack that mortally wounded Akagi, described the emotional complexity in a post-war interview. There was no celebration when we got back, not really. We'd lost too many good men, seen too many empty chairs in the ready rooms, but we knew we'd turned something and changed the war's direction. The Japs weren't invincible. Their carriers could burn just like anything else, and we had the ship, the planes, and the guts to make them burn. The Japanese military leadership struggled to comprehend what had happened at Midway. The official reports minimized losses, maintaining the fiction that Japan remained ascendant. But the pilots and sailors who survived knew the truth: the Americans were not the soft, decadent enemy that propaganda had promised. They were brave, skilled, and backed by industrial resources that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The Zero fighters that had dominated the war's opening months were being countered by new tactics and improved aircraft. The dauntless dive bombers, unglamorous workhorses, were proving devastatingly effective in skilled hands. And Enterprise, the Gray Ghost, was becoming a name spoken with wary respect. The ship that seemed to be present at every crucial battle, the carrier that absorbed punishment that should have sunk her but always survived to strike again. August 1942 brought Enterprise to the waters off Guadalcanal, where Marines had landed to seize the island's airfield and begin the grinding campaign up the Solomon Islands chain. The naval battles fought in these waters, marked by savage surface actions at night and carrier duels by day, would become some of the war's most brutal. On August 24th, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Enterprise and her escorts intercepted a Japanese force attempting to land reinforcements and destroy Henderson Field. The Japanese light carrier Ryujo was sunk by Enterprise's air group, but the price was steep. Japanese dive bombers broke through the combat air patrol and scored 3 direct hits on the Enterprise's flight deck. One bomb penetrated to the lower decks, killing 35 men and starting fires that threatened the ship's magazines. For 3.5 hours, damage control parties fought to save the ship while she continued operations, landing aircraft even as flames consumed portions of the hangar deck. Chief Damage Controlman Herbert Jones led a repair party into a compartment filled with explosive gases, knowing that a single spark could trigger a magazine detonation that would destroy the ship. He and his men secured the space, vented the gases, and isolated the fires, saving Enterprise at the cost of Jones's life. He was overcome by smoke and died at his post. For his actions, he would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His sacrifice represented the spirit that kept Enterprise fighting through damage that would have forced other ships to withdraw. The crew's determination, the quality of the ship's construction, and the skill of her damage control teams allowed her to steam under her own power back to Pearl Harbor for repairs that took 6 weeks. But more than the physical wounds, the battle demonstrated Enterprise's central role in the Guadalcanal campaign. She was not merely supporting ground operations but serving as the mobile airbase that made American presence in the Solomons possible. October 26, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz, this engagement, would see Enterprise pushed to her absolute limits, the moment when the ship came closest to destruction, and her legend grew to mythic proportions among both American sailors and Japanese pilots. The battle began as a carrier duel, Enterprise and the newly repaired Hornet against the Japanese carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and light carrier Zuiho. The air groups launched simultaneously, passing each other en route to their targets, a surreal moment where pilots could see the enemy strike heading the opposite direction, knowing that within minutes the fate of their ships would be decided by men they could not help, fighting battles they could not influence. Enterprise's dive bombers severely damaged Shokaku, putting her out of action for months of repair. But the Japanese struck back with overwhelming force. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers descended on the American task force. Hornet was hit repeatedly and fatally crippled, eventually sinking after attempts to scuttle her. Enterprise became the focus of follow-on attacks, her radar tracking incoming raids, her combat air patrol desperately trying to intercept. Despite the defensive efforts, Japanese bombs and one kamikaze, an already damaged aircraft that deliberately crashed into the carrier, struck Enterprise, killing 44 men and starting fires that again threatened the ship's survival. Yet within an hour, with fires still burning and damage control parties working frantically, Enterprise was recovering aircraft, her flight deck crew simply clearing wreckage to the side and resuming operations. The image of Enterprise absorbing punishment that sank other carriers, continuing to fight while damaged and refusing to yield, became central to her reputation. Japanese pilots who survived the battle reported hitting the American carrier repeatedly, claiming she was sunk or burning. Yet in subsequent battles, Enterprise would reappear, seemingly unkillable, earning her nickname among Japanese forces the Gray Ghost, the ship that should have died but refused to. Lieutenant Mutsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and later served as an analyst of carrier operations, wrote in his post-war account, "We thought we had destroyed Enterprise at Santa Cruz. The reports were clear of multiple hits, fires, and the ship dead in the water. But weeks later, there she was again, launching strikes, defending convoys. It was demoralizing. How do you defeat an enemy whose ships rise from the dead? The reality was less supernatural than Japanese pilots believed, but no less impressive. American damage control was simply superior, better trained, better equipped, and supported by a design philosophy that emphasized survivability. Watertight integrity, redundant systems, and crew expertise allowed American carriers to absorb damage that would cripple Japanese or British carriers. The cultural emphasis on individual initiative meant that damage control parties didn't wait for orders but responded immediately to threats. And the industrial base back in Pearl Harbor and the American West Coast could repair damage and implement upgrades at a pace that left Japanese strategists stunned. The Enterprise would be repaired and back in action within 6 weeks, fitted with improved anti-aircraft weapons and radar. Meanwhile, Shokaku would remain in yard until 1943, and Japan's carrier aircrew losses the trained pilots killed at Midway Santa Cruz and in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign could not be replaced. Through 1943, Enterprise participated in the systematic reduction of Japanese positions across the Central Pacific. The island-hopping campaign, bypassing strongly held positions to seize strategic locations, relied on carrier aviation to suppress Japanese air power, support amphibious landings, and interdict reinforcement. At Tarawa, the bloody assault on that tiny atoll, Enterprise aircraft provided close air support for Marines struggling against fanatical resistance. The experience was brutal for pilots unaccustomed to the precision required distinguishing between friendly and enemy forces, separated by yards, delivering ordnance close enough to suppress Japanese positions without killing American troops. Ensign George Gay, one of the few survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8 from Midway who later served on Enterprise, described the psychological toll. At Midway, we attacked ships. Clean, impersonal. At Tarawa, we saw what our bombs did to human beings. Saw Marines waving, guiding us in, then dropping ordnance 50 yards from their position. You couldn't think about it too hard or you'd go crazy. You just did the job and tried not to imagine the faces. The Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippine Sea Enterprise was present at every major campaign. Her air group racking up kills that mounted hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 19, 1944, saw Enterprise fighters part of the devastating aerial ambush that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, flown by hastily trained pilots who were no match for American veterans in superior aircraft, were shot down with such one-sided efficiency that the engagement became a slaughter. Of the approximately 450 Japanese aircraft that attacked the American fleet, 330 were destroyed, for the loss of 29 American planes. Enterprise's fighter squadron alone claimed 31 kills that day. Her pilots no longer the desperate defenders of 1942, but confident hunters who owned the sky. For Japanese pilots facing American carrier aircraft by 1944, the experience was nightmarish. The A6M0, which had dominated early war engagements through superior maneuverability, was now outclassed by American F-6F Hellcats that could outrun, outdive, and outgun it. American radar allowed fighters to intercept raids before they reached the fleet, while Japanese forces still relied on visual searches and pilot reports. The Americans had adopted the thatch weave and other tactics that neutralized the Zero's maneuverability advantage, turning dogfights into exercises in teamwork and firepower rather than individual dueling. And the endless stream of replacement aircraft and pilots meant that American losses while mourned were quickly filled. Japanese losses were irreplaceable holes in a force that could only grow weaker. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces who survived the war, wrote of his despair during late war missions. "We were sent to die, not to win, not even to damage the enemy significantly, but simply to die fighting because surrender was unthinkable. The Americans had so many planes, so many carriers. We would shoot down one and two more would take its place. And always the Enterprise was there, the ghost carrier, the ship we could never kill." The kamikaze campaign, beginning in October 1944, represented Japan's final evolution of naval air warfare, a doctrine born of desperation that sought to offset American material advantages through willingness to die. The logic was brutal but clear. A pilot on a one-way mission could achieve hit percentages far higher than conventional attacks, and Japan had more young men willing to die for the Emperor than America had ships. Enterprise faced repeated kamikaze attacks throughout the war's final year, her gunners and fighter pilots racing to splash the diving aircraft before they could impact the ship. On May 14, 1945, a single Zero evaded the defenses and crashed into the forward elevator, the explosion killing 14 men and tearing a 30-foot hole in the flight deck. Yet again, Enterprise's crew controlled the damage, repaired the flight deck, and resumed operations within hours. The determination of kamikaze pilots, young men who wrote farewell letters, tied on hachimaki headbands, and dove their aircraft into ships with full fuel tanks and maximum ordnance loads was undeniable, but it reflected strategic bankruptcy. Japan was spending its youth in single-use attacks because it could no longer fight effectively any other way. The pilots lacked the training to survive combat, so they were expended in suicide attacks. The industrial base couldn't replace losses, so aircraft were turned into manned missiles. The cultural emphasis on death before dishonor, on sacrifice for the Emperor, was being perverted into a killing machine that consumed Japan's own children in a futile attempt to stave off inevitable defeat. Enterprise, steaming through these desperate attacks, represented the antithesis of a force that valued its personnel, that trained them extensively, that provided them the best equipment American industry could produce, and that expected them to survive, to complete their missions and come home. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, Enterprise had participated in every major Pacific campaign except the Battle of the Coral Sea. She had earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship in World War II. Her aircraft had sunk or damaged 911 enemy ships, destroyed 911 aircraft in aerial combat, and supported every major amphibious operation from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. More than 71 of her air group personnel had become ace pilots credited with 5 or more aerial victories. She had steamed more than 275,000 miles in combat operations, equivalent to circling the globe 11 times, and she had survived damage that would have sunk other ships multiple times, earning the unofficial title of the most decorated and most dangerous American warship of World War II. The men who served aboard her carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Petty Officer 3rd Class William Thomas, who had joined the ship's company in 1943 and served through the war's end, spoke in a 1989 oral history interview about what Enterprise had meant. She was more than a ship. She was proof that we could win, that all the sacrifice meant something. When you saw her silhouette on the horizon, when you stood on that flight deck and watched the planes launch, you felt part of something bigger than yourself. We weren't just fighting for America or democracy or any of those abstract things. We were fighting for each other, for the shipmates we'd lost, for the right of people to live free from the kind of evil we were facing. And Enterprise was the tool that let us do that fighting. The question of why Enterprise became so dangerous, why she earned her fearsome reputation, has multiple answers that interweave technology, tactics, and human factors. Technologically, she represented American naval aviation at a pivotal moment, large enough to carry substantial air groups, but built before the war, forced designs toward maximum aircraft capacity at the expense of survivability. Her damage control systems, upgraded repeatedly throughout the war, made her exceptionally difficult to sink. Tactically, she was commanded by aggressive officers who understood carrier warfare's potential and pressed attacks even when outnumbered. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded Enterprise's task force through many early battles, epitomized this aggressive spirit, famously ordering, "Attack, repeat, attack," when faced with Japanese forces. And the human factor, the crew's determination, the air group's skill, the damage control party's heroism, transformed a ship made of steel into something that approached legend. But perhaps the deepest answer lies in what Enterprise represented to both sides. For Americans, she embodied the industrial might and innovative spirit that would ultimately win the war. She was proof that democracy could produce warriors as brave and skilled as any dictatorship, that free men fighting for just causes were more than a match for indoctrinated fanatics. For the Japanese, Enterprise became the symbol of their failure, the ship they couldn't sink, the enemy they couldn't outlast, the manifestation of the terrible mistake they'd made in attacking a power that would mobilize resources beyond anything their strategic planners had imagined. The gray ghost haunted Japanese naval operations because she represented an uncomfortable truth, that Japan's initial victories had been won against an unprepared enemy, and that once America mobilized, the material imbalance was so overwhelming that Japanese courage and skill could not overcome it. The symbolic power of a single ship seems almost absurd in the context of total war, involving millions of personnel and thousands of vessels. Yet symbols matter, particularly in wars where morale and will are as important as tonnage and firepower. Enterprise became the physical embodiment of American determination, the ship that absorbed everything the enemy could deliver and kept fighting. Her survival of battles that sank other carriers made her seem invincible, and that perception, whether accurate or not, had real effects on the war's conduct. American forces drew confidence from her presence. Japanese forces faced demoralization from her persistence. The ship's reputation amplified her tactical effectiveness, making her worth more than her aircraft complement or tonnage might suggest. In the war's aftermath, Enterprise faced an ignominious fate. The Navy, flooded with newer Essex-class carriers and facing peacetime budget constraints, determined that preserving the war's most decorated ship was economically unjustifiable. Despite public campaigns to save her as a museum, despite her unparalleled service record, she was sold for scrap in 1958 and broken up in 1960. The decision sparked outrage among veterans who had served aboard her and military historians who recognized her significance. But the pragmatic logic of Cold War naval budgets prevailed. The steel that had carried the war to Japan's doorstep was recycled into razors and automobiles. The physical form destroyed even as the memory endured. Perhaps there is a certain poetry in that end. A final lesson about the nature of military power and national purpose. Enterprise had been built to fight a war, and she fought it with distinction. When that war ended, when the crisis passed, the nation moved forward rather than dwelling in past glory. The men who served aboard her returned to civilian life, raised families, and built the post-war world. The ship herself was not preserved as a shrine but recycled, her substance contributing to the peacetime economy that her wartime service had defended. It was the American way, practical, forward-looking, unsentimental about materiel even while honoring the human sacrifice that materiel had enabled. The Japanese officers and sailors who survived the war carried their own memories of Enterprise, their own understanding of what the Gray Ghost had represented. For them, she symbolized the moment when the war's outcome became clear, when the initial victories gave way to grinding defeat, when the reality of American power overwhelmed the myths of racial superiority and spiritual strength that had sustained them. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had commanded the air attack on Pearl Harbor and later analyzed Japan's naval defeats, wrote in his memoirs, "We understood ships. We understood courage. What we failed to understand was the industrial system that could build ships faster than we could sink them, that could train pilots faster than we could kill them." Enterprise was not just a carrier. She was the symbol of that system, the proof that we had started a war we could never win. The lessons of Enterprise extend beyond World War II naval history into broader questions about warfare, technology, and national character. She demonstrated that survivability is as important as striking power, that the ability to absorb damage and continue fighting can be decisive. She proved that aggressive tactics combined with technological edge create synergies worth more than either element alone. She showed that crew-quality training, morale, initiative can compensate for material deficiencies and amplify material advantages. And she illustrated that symbols and reputation have tangible effects in warfare, that a ship or unit that earns a fearsome reputation gains advantages beyond its physical capabilities. In the decades since World War II, the United States Navy has carried the name Enterprise forward, most notably with CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which served from 1961 to 2017. That ship, like her predecessor, became one of the most decorated vessels in the fleet, participating in blockades during the Cuban Missile Crisis, combat operations in Vietnam, and power projection missions throughout the Cold War and War on Terror. The Navy is currently building CVN-80, which will bear the name Enterprise when commissioned in the 2030s, continuing the lineage. That continuity speaks to the power of the World War II carrier's legacy. She established a standard of excellence in combat effectiveness that the Navy seeks to honor and emulate across generations. For the historians and veterans who remember the original Enterprise, CV-6, the statistics and battle summaries only partially capture what made her special. The 20 battle stars and lists of ships sunk don't convey the experience of watching her steam into battle when you'd been told she was destroyed, or the sight of her flight deck launching strikes when other ships were withdrawing, or the sound of her engines driving her forward at flank speed toward the enemy, when every rational calculation said to retreat. The most dangerous American warship of World War II earned that title not just through the damage she inflicted, but through what she represented: the transformation of American industrial might into a weapon system that could project power across oceans, the embodiment of a free nation's determination to defeat tyranny, and the promise that courage and sacrifice in defense of liberty would be rewarded with victory. The sun sets over the Pacific, painting the water gold and crimson. Somewhere beneath those waves lie the wrecks of the carrier's Enterprise, which destroyed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and hundreds of other vessels that fell before her aircraft. In scrapyards and museums and photographs and memories, the Gray Ghost endures not as steel but as story, the chronicle of a ship and crew that answered their nation's call, and fought with distinction through the darkest hours and ultimate triumph. The most dangerous American warship of World War II was dangerous not because she was the largest or fastest or most heavily armed, but because she combined technological capability with human excellence, because she refused to die when death came calling, and because she represented ideals worth fighting for freedom, justice, and the belief that tyranny must be opposed at whatever cost. In the end, Enterprise was dangerous because America, when roused to war, proved itself the most formidable of all adversaries, willing to sacrifice but determined to prevail, capable of absorbing terrible blows but ultimately unstoppable in defense of the principles on which the nation stands. The Gray Ghost sailed those principles across the Pacific, and in her wake an empire fell and freedom advanced. That is her legacy, and that is why she remains, 75 years after the last gun fell silent, the most dangerous warship of her war.